Given its prolonged development, strange premise, and polarized reception, The Last Guardian is an enigma. While conceptually iterative of Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, the game takes various industry conventions and either recontextualizes or ignores them. Director Fumito Ueda has a history of going against the grain, but in his third outing, that tendency is at its most challenging. That challenge is one worth accepting though, because through its frustrations, inconveniences, and moments of disempowerment, The Last Guardian emerges as one of the most gratifying experiences that the medium has to offer. I'm going to show how the game unconventionally uses interactivity to effectively realize its central relationship and main themes, and while this video is squarely focused on The Last Guardian, I'll frequently cite Ico as an enlightening reference point. And that's a natural place to start, because on the face of it, Ico and The Last Guardian are practically the same game. Through a stroke of luck, a young boy predestined for sacrifice manages to escape, where he then tries to get back home by traversing ancient structures with the assistance of an AI companion. Criticizing The Last Guardian for being too derivative of Ico would be misleadingly reductive, however, because its relationship forces the player into a completely different position. When it comes to progressing through Ico's castle, the player is in charge, because outside of opening gates, illuminating some pathways, and occasionally providing hints, Yorda is defined by her limitations. She can't jump as well as Ico can, she can't climb or descend chains, she can't hang on ledges, she can't pick up items, she can't wield weapons, and so on. This is why the game's puzzles aren't about getting Ico to the right spot, they're about creating paths to circumvent Yorda's inabilities. You might have to find a lever that moves the platform she's standing on, or correctly position a block so she can climb up a ledge. Because your physical aptitude greatly exceeds Yorda's during gameplay, players will likely feel protective of her. It's fitting then that the game's central mechanic and most famous image sees Ico tightly dragging the girl behind him. In stark contrast, Trico and the boy's dissimilar yet complementary abilities create a relationship where the roles of both are fluid. Trico can jump up to lofty perches or across immense gaps, while the boy will crawl through holes and sidle along ledges. Trico can demolish obstructions by shooting lightning from its tail, while the boy will have to destroy talismans that petrify the animal. Trico can overpower enemies that the boy can't defeat on his own, while the boy will have to track down barrels if the beast ever gets tired. The boy, or the player, continually alternates between protector and protected, sometimes a hybrid of the two, and Trico is consequently viewed through a variety of lenses. This connection feels far more reciprocal than Ico and Yorda's, but what's most interesting is how The Last Guardian illustrates the flexibility of game mechanics by reframing many of Ico's motifs to create a dissimilar relationship. Both games have puzzles, but while Yorda could sometimes help players by pointing them towards solutions, you point out objects of interest to help Trico. Both games are platformers, but while Ico's platforming often occurs away from Yorda due to her inabilities, the boy depends on Trico to act as an adjustable platform. Both games feature combat and enemies, but while you fight the shadows to reinforce your role as a protector for Yorda, the knights are fought by Trico to reinforce its role as a protector for you. Ultimately, The Last Guardian repurposes many of Ico's ideas to create a distinct relationship that demonstrates the limitations of a one-size-fits-all approach. However, I've neglected Ico's ending sequence where Yorda saves the titular character from the collapsing castle, because while you could say their relationship becomes mutual here, this scene is perhaps the clearest example as to why these games feel so different. Yorda's heroics are shown through a cutscene, where Ico's lack of autonomy is conveyed by a removal of interactivity, which is effective in its own way, but whenever the boy loses his freedom, The Last Guardian instead conserves player control. For a clear example, take this section when the boy gets caught on a tree. Pressing the face buttons causes him to wiggle around, and although I spent minutes trying to rhythmically dislodge myself on my first playthrough, the only way forward is to call on Trico so it can save you. Though this set piece seems rather extreme, the harsh reality is that it essentially repeats itself on a smaller scale throughout the whole journey. The game's early hours are spent on Trico's back hoping it'll know where to jump, but even after the boy can issue commands, the animal still has to follow them, and it's specifically programmed to ignore you under certain circumstances. It's likely then that players will find themselves knowing how to solve a puzzle, yet unable to do anything about it because they're so dependent upon Trico's AI, which can be frustrating. Sitting around without a direct way of controlling your progression is subversive of the entire medium. Most games will place the player in a primary role, giving them both the freedom to decide what to do and the power to overcome obstacles on their own. I don't even need to go digging for a game as an example here because I just spent several minutes discussing one. It makes sense to have players use a controller to engage in an experience where they have control, but I think The Last Guardian's approach to interactivity, where it frequently disempowers the player and puts them in a secondary role, has irreplicable strengths. Before explaining why I feel that way though, I need to establish something first. Games not only don't need to be consistently fun to play, many of them would be better if they were less fun. Now, that's a controversial opinion, so let's back up with an analogy. Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon is perhaps the most accessible progressive rock album ever made, but it still contains some eccentricities. Consider the record's third track, On the Run, which is an instrumental interlude that places strange samples of pattering footsteps and laughter over a pulsating kick drum, frantic hi-hat, and otherworldly synth line. This is then followed by the song Time, an absolutely gutting reminder of our own mortality, with captivating vocal performances and one of the most emotionally moving guitar solos ever recorded. I, and the majority of that record's listeners, vastly prefer Time to On the Run, but both are invaluable to the album's overall quality. On the Run's surreal soundscape establishes a tonal and atmospheric springboard that allows tracks like Time to reach even loftier emotional heights. Criticizing the song for being too repetitive or lacking in melody is missing the forest for the trees, where zooming in and isolating the track leads to ignorance about its larger purpose as a stepping stone within the record. As another example, films such as 2001: A Space Odyssey use numerous long takes to deliberately slow down the pace. These extended, or boring shots allow the audience to really soak everything in, and moments that subvert the glacial pace are made far more striking as a result. Here's what I'm getting to. Moments that are repetitive, slow, or boring can all be effective tools for supporting an artistic vision because they don't exist in a vacuum, even if they might normally be viewed as flaws. However, games differ from other forms of entertainment due to their general focus on immediacy. An ability to take control of the experience is a big part of this medium's allure, so audiences and developers alike have grown an understandable aversion to any needless time that strips the player of their agency. Sitting through slow text is excruciating, so some games allow you to speed it up. Long cutscenes placed right after save points are aggravating to rewatch if you die, so some games let you skip them. Loading screens ruin immersion and are boring, so the 9th generation of consoles have, of course, advertised how short they are now. I'm not suggesting that immediacy is a bad thing, far from it. Most games could benefit from less wasted time, but I think the medium's emphasis on convenience has conditioned players to automatically attribute any frustration or boredom they experience while playing to poor game design, without consideration for why the designer might want them to feel that way in the first place. The pervasive preconception that games should always prioritize fun has value in some instances, but demanding every game to subscribe to that philosophy only limits our understanding of how interactivity can creatively induce emotions and convey ideas. What do The Last Guardian's more frustrating sections achieve then, and why can't any of those achievements be replicated by a smoother experience? I think the answer to that question lies in both the most realized character and most powerful relationship found in anything I've played, because, as counterintuitive as this sounds, relationships are largely defined by inconvenience. When receiving help, you'll likely be most grateful when it requires some level of sacrifice from that other person, because someone putting your well-being above theirs indicates that they care about you, and vice versa. Additionally, successful cooperation with others necessitates discussion, disagreement, and compromise, and we're likely to hit emotional rough patches with even our closest of friends. All of this is to say that relationships are work, and that's part of their beauty. There is a long-term satisfaction in overcoming adversities with and selflessly uplifting another person that makes relationships some of life's most meaningful pursuits, but games have often been too scared to evoke these real emotions just because of the attached inconveniences. As an example, take Ellie from The Last of Us. Her relationship with Joel showcases some of the best writing in the medium, but the game shoots itself in the foot because it doesn't retain that level of consideration during gameplay. Monsters that rip your throat out if they hear you are programmed to completely ignore Ellie and other allies as they carelessly run around, so getting caught is never out of your control. Although this seems to be a concession due to unpolished AI instead of an artistic decision, by sacrificing the believability of your companions during stealth, the game undermines its own premise just to ensure that players aren't frustrated. The game is never as annoying as escort missions tend to be, but you have to care about Ellie in spite of the gameplay, not because of it. In contrast, The Last Guardian's core relationship feels so real because the game doesn't lazily sacrifice Trico's authenticity and accommodate the player at every moment. The beast sometimes gets hungry and won't move until you feed it, progress frequently stalls as the animal's concentration wanes, and Trico will seldom understand commands unless you position yourself so it can see you. Though The Last Guardian never explains Trico's eyesight, it's incredibly intuitive when you stop viewing the animal as a game mechanic to exploit and begin thinking about it as a real creature you have to communicate with. And despite what this video has focused on so far, the game is still generally enjoyable. From cute interactions with Trico to thrilling scripted sequences, there's plenty of opportunities to sit back and appreciate the game's endless amount of charm. These moments are impactful though because the animals' behavioral quirks, as irritating as they may be, create this palpable impression of life that emanates from the game's every second. By prioritizing Trico's autonomy over the player's comfort and purposefully challenging the medium's focus on convenience, The Last Guardian wondrously captures our most meaningful connections with each other. That's likely the game's greatest accomplishment. In a few other aspects, the game isn't quite as successful, however. The frame rate noticeably dips when you're entering new areas or encountering enemies on base PS4, and though the PS4 Pro and PS5 seem better equipped to run the game, it's disappointing to see Inueta release struggle to perform on its initial console for the third consecutive time. There's also a lot of input lag, which normally isn't too bad because the game rarely requires precision, but it sometimes creates problems when using the analog sticks. The dead zones for both are massive, so the time it takes for the stick to be fully tilted combines with the input delay to make subtle character and camera adjustments needlessly difficult. Camera issues don't end there though. Whenever the player is wedged between Trico and a wall, it's impossible to discern where the boy is and what you're doing. I can understand this problem because Trico's size was likely difficult to work around, but I can't excuse the button prompts. These unremovable messages invade the environment just to remind you of the actions you've been performing for hours. It's frustrating that these prompts distract you so frequently because The Last Guardian is absolutely gorgeous. Wind rushes through the boy's robes and Trico's feathers, rays of light shimmer through the mist to reveal insects and hanging dust, and the atmosphere's heavenly glow envelops the colossal structures that serve as the game's setting. I think the nest is my favorite location in any game, firstly because each section feels permanent. Most of the outdoor areas you explore are clearly visible from other parts of the ruins, which isn't particularly unique on its own, but the nest's palpability is given immense value because of the game's verticality. Consider the Citadel. As soon as Trico violently roars at the White Tower, while the camera slowly pans up for what seems an eternity, your goal is clear, even hours before the game confirms it: reach the top. The thematic link between progression and physical elevation is so effective that it's likely existed as long as stories have, and the Citadel beautifully realizes this trope because it acts as a concrete reference point that contextualizes how far you've come with Trico, both literally and figuratively. Looking down at courtyards you occupied hours earlier, or surveying spires you've yet to climb, isn't just immersive then, it's another element reinforcing the core relationship. These landmarks stick with you so easily though because of the game's fantastic environmental design. Something Ueda and I seem to share is an artistic interest over a mechanical interest, and although that preference somewhat explains the technical shortcomings of his games, it also influences his worlds. Giant mobiles with metallic washers 8 feet in diameter and tunnels constructed dozens of feet underwater might not make functional sense for an intelligent species that once lived here, but they make artistic sense as engrossing backdrops. Despite the surrealistic imagery, however, the nest never feels artificial because it's abundant in empty space. Patches of moss or hidden staircases may suggest that there are secret areas or barrels at the end of them, and while that's true on occasion, they often lead to absolutely nothing. Though this could be construed as a pointless time waster, what's more important is how it positively alters your perception of the setting, because it doesn't seem like the nest has been deliberately designed to facilitate your escape, even though it, of course, has. The only discernible problem with the art direction could be that building interiors and caverns are rather uninteresting, but I actually think the game flips this in its favor. Outdoor areas, with their calming winds and lively fauna, appear even prettier because they dramatically contrast against the dark caves, and transitions between the two are sometimes perfectly accentuated by musical accompaniment. Despite its complexity, The Last Guardian's orchestral score manages to remain both emotionally versatile and emotionally intelligible. It's often appropriately delicate, like with the track Wounded that sees an oboe gracefully hovering over percussive embellishments and sonorous string harmonies. The strings really serve as the heart and soul of this entire soundtrack, and they dynamically escalate and de-escalate here to give the song a great sense of momentum. When dormant nights come into view, however, the score betrays its own elegance by using woodwinds to instead elicit unease. Sentinel-1 throws the sullen rattle of a bass clarinet into a sea of ominous strings as shadowy percussion lingers in the distance. If, after awakening, the knights capture the boy, Sentinel-2 generates pure terror. The string melody concluding this piece highlights the minor 2nd and major 7th scale degrees, in this context an F and D sharp respectively. These are the two closest notes to the track's root of E, and by creating a sense of claustrophobia around the tonic amidst a devastating crescendo, the track thunderously conveys the mounting horror of being physically trapped. Like the game itself, this soundtrack knows exactly when to be dissonant, when to go in unpredictable places and challenge audience expectations, but also when to be unambiguously breathtaking. Composer Takeshi Furukawa deserves a lot of credit here because his score is outstanding. It greatly intensifies the game's most important moments. This lengthy flashback detailing how Trico and the boy crossed paths would be unremarkable if not for Ueda's other games, as Ico and Shadow of the Colossus both revel in their ambiguity. Questions surrounding the nature of the castle or Wander's relationship with Mono are, as far as the games are concerned, not answered, which allows players to fill in the story's gaps however they desire. It's a big reason why these games have such a mystifying allure to them. Explicitly showing the story's supporting details seems to conflict with that ambiguity then, but I ultimately think the flashback is a beneficial inclusion. It's hard to imagine the ending making much sense if we had never seen the boy's village, and by showing Trico's abduction after players have developed a bond with it, the animal is viewed with sympathy here rather than hostility. The flashback simply clarifies and refines the most essential plot points, and The Last Guardian still contains plenty of mysteries. The presence of statues indicates that some advanced civilization once lived in the nest. The boy appears to have been specifically chosen by Trico for some reason, and the master of the valley is one massive question mark. Is it a machine? Is it an alien? Is it a brain of some sort? Is its coffin actually housing a body, or is it just a monument? If its body really isn't there, does that mean everyone who once lived here was giant, or is that what made the master unique? The story's implications are still compelling enough, and sometimes dark enough, to guide the player's curiosity towards some mesmerizing ideas, even though the flashback somewhat limits the possibilities. Analyzing this one scene in isolation is rather futile, however, because the entire game is presented as a story being recounted by the protagonist when he's much older. Initially, the narration seems like a transparent disguise for the game's hint system, and while that's definitely one of its functions, I think its ultimate purpose is to instill a sense of wisdom within the narrative. We inherently associate retrospection with introspection, so framing the story in the past tense invites us to learn from the boy's journey with Trico. The narrator's design subtly reveals that he's learned from these experiences as well. In the aforementioned flashback, the only translated words come from an older man wearing unique garments around his neck. I then think it's safe to assume this is the village elder the narrator references, and after comparing the elder's attire to that of the protagonists, it looks like the boy eventually takes that position. It's implied that his time spent alongside Trico has given him the necessary wisdom to act as both a leader for his people and a role model for us, and this arc is one of the many ways that the game conveys its environmental message. Most stories centered around a man versus nature conflict are critical of humanity's irreverence for the natural world, and The Last Guardian is no exception. The Master of the Valley maliciously enslaves animals to abduct children, and the nest's man-made structures frequently collapse under Trico's weight while the natural environment is as vigorous as ever. Instead of merely condemning mankind and exalting nature, however, the game more strongly advocates for an alliance of the two, as it's a man who cooperates with the environment that ultimately defeats a being looking to subjugate it. I think this eco-critical interpretation is only half of the picture though, with the game's final puzzle piece coming into focus as soon as players press start. The mirror is the Last Guardian's most interesting mechanic because it blatantly opposes the game's core principles. In contrast to the unreliability of commands, this mirror consistently causes Trico to shoot lightning from its tail, meaning that the item actually empowers the player in a game largely about disempowerment. This distinction is best exemplified by a segment inside the Citadel, where the boy has to activate numerous switches that are covered by knights. As Trico's tail hangs from above, you could lure the knights towards the center area and use the mirror to effortlessly obliterate them, or you can ignore the mirror and attempt to outrun the enemies by yourself, making this the most difficult section of the game. By giving players the option to easily harness Trico's power, this decision further demonstrates how painless the game could be if the boy had greater control of the animal throughout. It's worth noting that using the item also causes Trico's eyes to shine pink, indicating fearfulness and hostility. For the brief time players have it then, the mirror appears to contradict the game's primary goal of preserving Trico's autonomy, because it does, but the reason this is a virtue rather than a vice relates to where the mirror is found, embedded in the frigid sarcophagus of the Master of the Valley. Alongside the talismans and the antennae and the fragrances and the knights, the mirror is yet another tool designed to exploit nature. However, while the other devices act as obstacles throughout the nest to signify the master's heartlessness, the boy uses the mirror's destructive power to ironically liberate nature, illustrating his benevolence. It's a boy who works alongside Trico, who doesn't have direct influence over it, who experiences the difficult yet satisfying process of building a real relationship with it that's able to defeat an antagonist that chooses the convenient but destructive option of controlling the animal for personal gain. If the parallel I'm drawing still isn't clear, let me put it this way. Just as the game is about a boy cooperating with nature to overthrow a being that selfishly seeks to control it, The Last Guardian is about players having to relinquish their own desire for control over Trico so they can instead build a meaningful relationship with it. The game's internal themes have been externally realized through the frustrations many have felt while playing because those themes are conveyed through interaction. Our connection with Trico shows us the merit in having both a positive relationship with others and a positive relationship with nature. The animal's tendency to ignore our commands teaches us how inconvenient those relationships can be. The mirror conversely allows us to control our companion at the expense of its freedom so we can feel how convenient that power is, and the obstacles scattered throughout the nest remind us of the dangerous endgame that lust for control leads to. This alignment between narrative and gameplay is so incredibly cohesive because we naturally want to have control of our games. In a way, we are the Master of the Valley. What The Last Guardian is saying though, is that sometimes we need to just let go. By letting go of our desire to always be in control during games, and letting go of our preconceptions on what those games should or shouldn't do, something unexpected or beautiful might grow from the place our iron fist once rested. Because it casts off player expectations and the supposed restrictions of the medium, The Last Guardian allows itself to spread its wings and soar, and although that flight experiences some turbulence, the places it eventually leads to more than justify the decision to take that journey.